for the CD DVD, basically we're using this ISO. It says CD DVD. Don't let that bother you. We are using this image that you see right here, but for all intents and purposes, you know, it lists here, and this is the source that it's going to install from. Now, if you did want to customize, you can select here and do a couple things. One, we can choose exactly where we want to install to. I'm going to go ahead and put it under my documents under virtual machine, so it'll go right where CentOS and Windows 8 are, which makes a lot of sense for you know, quite obvious reasons. And now let's go ahead and hit finish. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and, I guess, do what we did earlier, which I just brought up, and say, yep, the name is fine, looks good to me. So we hit save, and now what it's going to go ahead and do is bring everything up. So watch this. At this point now, because we are virtualizing, look at this. It looks almost, for those of you that may have installed Windows before, it almost looks, with the exception of all this desktop cut away, it looks as if we just turned a computer on with a disk in. It's reading right off the disk and getting ready to go. And really, largely, that is true. That's essentially what we've got going on here. So we can go ahead and wait. And what's happening right now is you can see this is running inside of inside of VMware Fusion. And so really this software that's running in here really has no idea that it's being virtualized. It does not know, this install right here does not know it's actually part of a larger operating system. And the reason for that is because VMware Fusion, again, is virtualizing all of the instances of my physical hardware and delivering it to this desktop, or I shouldn't say this desktop, I should say this server, as if it is its own individual hardware. Okay, so that's really what allows me to do this. And actually, we can even hold over some of these things and see some of the hardware that's being used. You know, it's virtualizing my hard disk as a SCSI drive, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go over all of these because it's really not too important at this point. Okay, so here we go. We're ready to go. We're ready to begin the install. Now, just for your sake and mine, I'm going to go ahead and choose. I'm going to go ahead and full screen this. Okay, so this will just let us it sees everything a little bit bigger and easier for you to see probably on the video as well. So we're going to go ahead and select our English US options. You know, if you're watching this from another country, you need to change that. Go ahead and do that as you need. Now, one thing I always like to do, I do like to point out to my students. Look at this down here, this repair your computer. Sometimes this is very, very, very useful. Now, there are other ways that you can get to your repair partition or system partition to go ahead and change some settings. But this is one way that you can get right in. Now, we're not going to choose this right now, but I do make note that this is available right here, and this can be useful in the cases where your SAM file may get corrupted, perhaps your registry Hive gets corrupted. I have had situations like that before. Maybe a user forgets. My students will occasionally forget their administrator password. So these are nice ways that you can go in and go into your repair partition and essentially run what I like to call just low-level commands to make changes to your operating system. And it's very, very powerful, a little bit more complicated, but you can do some powerful things to recover your machine if you run into some kind of catastrophic failure. All right, we're not going to choose that though. We're not going to talk about that right now, although we may later. Go ahead and hit install now. And now it's going to go ahead and begin the installation. So notice it says setup is starting. It's going to go ahead and start querying my hardware, seeing what's out there. Keep in mind all of this is virtualized. And it also is going to go ahead and look on the ISO or the image and say, hey, what do we have available here? So notice what I want to point out to you, we have a lot of different versions. We have Windows 2008, R2 Standard. We have both full and server core. Same with Enterprise, same with Data Center, same with Web Server. Now, all of this is Windows Server 2008 R2, Release 2. The difference between each of these is, first of all, each edition. We have Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Server. Now, we don't have time in this lecture to go through each of these and what the differences are between these, but they are for different purposes. It makes sense that we're going to go ahead and use Standard today, but later on we'll talk about the differences between Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web Server. You need to know the difference, especially when you're making purchasing decisions. There's no need to purchase Data Center, for example, and Web Server will do the trick for you. The second thing I want to make note of is full installation versus server core. Essentially what server core is a far more stripped down version of Windows. It's very akin to running a non-graphics version of Linux. In my opinion, Microsoft really took a smart decision here and kind of took a page out of Linux and Unix's book and saying, you know what, there are instances where we don't need a full-blown operating system. And there are many cases where a server core installation, which is essentially non-graphics and more stripped down, is more suitable as a replacement. And keep in mind the thoughts behind this are twofold. First of all, it's going to be faster. The less you have running, the faster it's going to operate. Secondly, a nice thing about Server Core is that it has, again, when we strip away a lot of the unnecessary things like graphics, essentially we're stripping away code. What do we know about code? The more code that is existent on our machine, the more space, the more possibility for vulnerabilities. And so the more we can strip away, the better off we're going to be, statistically speaking. Okay, so we're going to go with full installation. All that being said, so let's go ahead and hit next on this, and we have Microsoft's typical EULA end user license agreement. We can scroll through and read this. I am not going to tell you to do that, and I know very few people that are interested in this, even lawyers. So not to say it's not useful, not to say it's not binding. Both of those are true. We're just going to go ahead and accept it. Now at this point we have the ability to upgrade or do a custom installation. In many cases this upgrade will be ghosted out, especially if you're starting on a drive with no data on it. Perhaps it's been formatted and clean. This may be ghosted out. Okay. However, it may not be ghosted out if you already are running, let's say, Windows Server 2003 and ready to upgrade from 03 to 08. Okay. However, for us, we're going to go ahead and do a custom installation. Now, notice for us, we had already specified that 40 gigs was enough. Do you remember earlier in our custom initialization we specified 40 gigs? You remember that? Well, guess what? This has been delivered, 40 gigs. So when this install comes up and when VMware Fusion is virtualizing our hardware, part of what it does is it says, hey, you've got a hard drive and you have 40 gigs. Now, I actually have far more than 40 gigs available on my MacBook Pro, but we are giving to it 40 gigs is what we're saying it has available. Okay, so that's why this is showing up as saying, hey, I see a 40 gig drive. It's actually bigger than that, but this is my virtualized drive that I said you get 40 gigs worth. We could hit drive options here and look at some of this. There are some cases where we may want to specify perhaps 2-3 different partitions, something like that. So let's go ahead and go assign one partition. Let's say in this case if we have 40 gigs available, let's go ahead and assign 30 gigs to it. Okay. So we're going to say 30,000 megs, which is 30 gigs, and hit apply. And it's going to say, hey, in order to make sure all this is going to work correctly, we might need some additional partitions. All right, sounds good to me, Microsoft. And look what it did here for us. Okay. In this case, we now have partition 2, and we have our 30 gigs assigned, 29.2, close enough, right? Then we have unallocated space, about 10 gigs. Add these two up, comes out to about 40 gigs, doesn't it? Pretty close. Now also notice we have a 100 meg system reserved partition. Okay. We will talk about the use for this later. One of the big uses, though, of course, at least to say this quickly, is this is basically just a system partition that we can use to have some data on for recovery purposes, for boot up purposes, some things like that. Okay. Now notice that this is ghosted out. If I try to install Windows to disk partition 1, 100 megs, not going to work for obvious reasons. There is no way we can install Windows Server 2008 on 100 megs. You know that, I know that. Secondly, notice that we could attempt to install it on this unallocated space, but it's giving us a warning. It's saying, hey, listen, I can do this, but we really need close to 13 gigs to do this. So let's go ahead and select partition 2. Notice this is the primary partition. This is the system partition. In another lecture, we'll talk about the differences between these two. Okay, so at this point we can kind of sit tight and wait. What we've got going on here is we have begun the install. And so at this point it is copying all the files, it's expanding everything, and then it's going to begin the installation. Now again, remember all of this in my case is coming off an ISO, so this actually will be pretty quick for me because we're going to have faster read-write speed than off a DVD. If you are installing off a DVD instead of an ISO, this may take a little bit longer, and that's okay. Don't worry about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back here and resume this video when we get to about close to 100%, and we'll come back. That way I don't have to make you wait through all of this. Okay, so here we are. We're back to about 95%, so it's a good time for us to pick back up on this video as we begin finishing the expansion of our Windows files. So here we are at 100%, and so now it's getting ready to actually begin the install. Everything has been unpacked from its compressed formats, and it's beginning to go ahead and do the install. And notice this, at least on this machine, is really pretty quick. Again, installing off an ISO really can be a lot faster, especially if your drive has fast read-write speeds. So it's going to go ahead and attempt a restart. restart, and here we go. Notice we saw that VMware logo, which is kind of the front end in between the actual operating system and the hardware. It's again the virtualization component. Some people call it the hypervisor. And so here we go. We see the Microsoft little loading screen right there, and Windows Server 2008 is beginning the actual reboot process. So made a couple registry changes, and now back to this window again, completing installation. Is going to finish up, clean up a few things, and we should be ready to go on our version of Windows Server 2008. Okay, so we see now Windows is beginning what they're calling our first use. So we see this nice snazzy little light peeking through something or other. And here we go. Okay, so the first